It's been 50 years since the first American prisoners of war were first brought home from the Wa Lo prison in Vietnam. Known to prisoners as the Hanoi Hilton, Wa Lo held hundreds of American soldiers, including the late Senator John McCain between 1964 and 1973. 50 years ago this week, with the end of the Vietnam War, the first of those prisoners were released and flown home to the United States. Some 600 American POWs who later described the extreme torture, isolation, and starvation they endured there.
They blindfolded me, bound and gagged me, put me on a truck and bumped me over the 27 miles in the back of a dump truck into the Hanoi Hilton to begin 6 years. I'm put in a cell. I've not seen another soul, and I'm left by myself. It was the worst period in my life, including the torture. I wanted to die. There is no question about that. Everything in my life had been taken away from me.
Their capture, imprisonment, and eventual release is the focus of a new exhibition at the American Heritage Museum, featuring an original cell shipped from Vietnam, first-hand accounts from soldiers like those you just heard from, and interactive displays. The exhibit offers a look at the brutal conditions faced by American prisoners. I'm joined by Rob Collings now. He's president of the American Heritage Museum. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Jared.
Well, I just kind of outlined in the broadest sense we'll talk about why it was called the Hanoi Hilton, what it was like, but what was the essence of what was happening there?
The Hanoi Hilton was a prison that went back to the late 1800s, a French colonial prison that a lot of the airmen and soldiers were held in during the Vietnam War. And they endured some of the most brutal physical and psychological torture. They would be in isolation for, in many cases, 3-4 years before they saw anyone else. So it's an amazing story of the human spirit, of how they survived this. And they really kind of came together and pulled one another up when they had these really, really awful days.
I toured this with you recently, and the experience I felt that I had there was just incredible, like any museum experience where you can have firsthand contact with something that actually existed, that I think many of us picture from the John McCain pictures, actually knowing where he suffered. What's the experience that you expect visitors will have when they come face to face with an actual prison cell?
So everyone knows the POW MIA flag. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. But what is that about? What did they go through? And to go inside one of those cells, actually stand on the concrete floor they were standing, you see these concrete bed slabs with shackles that their legs would be shackled to. It brings a whole new understanding of what it was like. And it's still mind-boggling to me, going in there day after day, that they could have endured that.
I think one of the things that was so impactful to me was we saw one of the accounts there from your museum, the interviews that you did with surviving POWs about that experience. Once you're hearing the brutality that they endured as you're looking at this prison, it's nearly incomprehensible. But you worked with the POWs, the surviving POWs, for this exhibition. How did you work with them? What did they share? Because again, this is something I'm sure they don't particularly want to remember.
The POWs that we were working with are just an amazing group of gentlemen. What they went through, how normal they are today, when you think about the torture and abuse they went through, then physically and mentally, they're so amazing. But we needed them for multiple reasons. One is there's no photos of what this looked like. The Vietnamese didn't take any pictures of what the torture room looked like or anything like that. You had to go back and get those accounts from them. And one of those gentlemen, Mike McGrath, he has just a remarkable memory. So when he came home, he was sketching everything as an artist, sketching what it looked like. And those are your firsthand accounts, really, of what was going on there. So that was a part of it for this reconstruction of these cells, because they'd been deconstructed. They came to us as pallets of bricks and concrete slabs and so forth that had to be put back together again. But then it's that human story, it's that essence of what they went through. And to have them on film, projected in these cells, telling the story of what it was like, makes it exceptionally real for people when they go through.
So how did they survive this? Some of these men were there for, I think, up to 7 years, and it's not just men. In a few cases, there were women as well. Solitary confinement for years and years and years. No access to the outside world, not supposed to even be able to communicate with other prisoners. How did they survive?
It's almost impossible to imagine they survived, especially when you bring up like this isolation, that they were by themselves. The first airman shot down as a POW, Ev Alvarez, was there in 1964. Now, it's a lonely thought to be in a prison cell in solitary confinement. Then when you know you're the only one, I can't even begin to imagine it. Then there was a second, a third, and they came in. And shortly thereafter, they established this tap code, and it was arranging the alphabet in a 5 by 5, and they'd be tapping to one another messages. Now, getting caught doing that meant you would go into the shackles, and in some cases for months on end. And I don't mean at nighttime. They would be in leg shackles for months on a concrete slab. But it was so important to communicate, like we're doing right now. Could you imagine 3-4 years without communicating with another human being? So even just if you're tapping through a wall and you're able to let them know on the other side you're not alone, that was amazing. Now later in the war, after about 1970, they're putting a lot of prisoners together for a variety of reasons. That changed everything for them. You might have been in a little cell and it was crowded and there were 4 guys in there. But that's 4 guys where you can start to suck information out of their heads. They called it Hanoi University. You might speak German, I might speak Spanish. We're going to teach you in another language.
Just something to do for the 24 hours that you're in.
Keep your mind occupied. That was the biggest thing, was keeping your mind occupied, because that solitary confinement's one of the worst things imaginable. Your mind just starts running away all the time.
Well, you also illustrate in this exhibition the terror that they had. They would hear the keys jangling as they were coming, and they knew that meant that they were going to be pulled out of the cell and tortured again. We know that John McCain could never lift his arm above a certain length because their arms were pulled out of their sockets. And yet, going back to the Hanoi Hilton, that was a sense of humor that they had. It was their title, the Hanoi Hilton, in the midst of all of this trauma.
So the name Hanoi Hilton came with the second prisoner, and he just wrote it. They had a little tiny piece of toilet paper, was normally, that was their paper if they were lucky enough to have any, and they would write down, he wrote down this message when he saw this third airman get shot down looking through a hole, "Welcome to the Hanoi Hilton," and he hid this message. That's how it became known as that. It was a sense of humor. It was joking. And humor was so important to them. They all broke at some point. They went past the code of conduct, name, rank, serial number. But they would have these stories because the Vietnamese couldn't believe like an F-4 Phantom could fly off of an aircraft carrier. They said, no, it needs a 5,000-foot runway. And they would say, well, we have a lot of ships out in the Gulf of Tonkin. We just line them up in a row and we make 5,000 feet. They would do all sorts of things that for them, when they went back to their cell, brought them a sense of joy almost, that they were just having these jokes that they could have.
For the opening of this exhibition recently, you had a number of POWs there. What was that experience like?
That was an amazing day to have 19 of these POWs there at that exhibit and to have them up on stage and to hear their stories. And it wasn't what you would think. There was not the gory stories of what they went through with, as you said, dislocating shoulders was a very popular thing for the Vietnamese to do for torturing. But it was the stories of resilience. It was a story we can all relate to. We've all had difficult days, and they had really difficult days, but they were there for one another, and how they came together and brought one another back up when they were at their lowest point. That was the inspiration for me.
As I mentioned, this is the 50th anniversary. We're now in the 50th anniversary cycle of when the first POWs started coming home. What was their experience like? Because I think we recall that the experience for a lot of Vietnam veterans was they were coming back to a country that was very hostile to them for participating in the war.
So we have these POWs returning to the U.S. to a very different place than what they left. They missed out on a lot of what went on. You know, when the first guy was shot down, the Beatles hadn't come to the U.S. By the time he came out, the band had broken up. Man had walked on the moon. MLK had been assassinated. Look at all these events that defined that period. But they did have something. They did have a lot of resources that were expended on them for their physical condition, for their mental condition, and also they were celebrities when they came back. They came back to more of a hero's welcome. They had a dinner at the White House with John Wayne and all these people. And to a degree, they felt a survivor's guilt. And they said, we came home to this, to a White House dinner, yet everyone else came home to getting spit on at the airport. And those guys lost legs and arms and things. So it's amazing how someone who could go through such a horrible experience still feel survivor's guilt.
Rob, before I let you go, I have to quickly ask, in our last segment, we were just talking about shooting down these UFOs. It's this phenomenon that seems to be happening now, but it's not a new one, as you pointed out to me when I was at your museum. When did this start, as you can prove?
Well, balloons for observation go back to the Civil War. And in World War I, they were a mainstay of observation behind enemy lines, looking in. What was the other side doing, moving material and troops to the front? So we have a World War I aircraft, actually America's first fighter plane, a Newport 28, French-built aircraft. And those were predominantly used for shooting down other aircraft, but balloons were a big part of that. And a very, very difficult target, because the balloons then were tethered and had a large amount of anti-aircraft guns around it. Now we have F-22s shooting down balloons, which is a much easier prospect. But 110 years on, and things are back to the same.
And yours is staying put, though. It hasn't been conscripted yet.
No, it hasn't been conscripted yet. They have something better to use.
Well, Rob, the exhibition has stayed with me for the days since I saw it about the Hanoi Hilton. Thank you so much for being here to talk about it.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.